Okay. Take two. Hello, everybody. You people in the future are probably wondering what? I'm repeating this so that you people in the future can get this lecture. And the people in the present, somewhere out there, hello, we're streaming live. So what I started saying is I truly am super excited. I can feel it kind of in my body because it's so great to have a person like Lita Albuquerque be someone who represents art, science, design, media, arts overlap. She is an inspiration to me as an artist, someone who started as a painter, continued exploring with the environment and space and sculpture and technology and space, and still is like a painter, still looks at space and light and color like a painter, which is so amazing, and it really crosses the traditional and the new in a way that relaxes a lot of people who are in established art world worried about what does it mean when you're crossing over to technology and science, etc. So I will just mention a few things. She is an alumni of UCLA, and I knew until just a few moments that she graduated in art history, but I didn't know that she actually started in the art department, and after getting a D in drawing, decided to switch to art history. So go figure. That is also an inspiration to all you guys who are getting Ds. Then we move on to Art Center, where she's teaching. Now she's teaching in the graduate program. In Pasadena, the Arts Council just gave her an award for art and science. It's a new award, which is fantastic. And then the very prestigious MoCA gave her a Distinguished Artist Award recently. I will just keep it at that and ask you to give her a thunderous applause and welcome her and thank her for being here.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. Victoria, thank you. Amy was one of my students at Art Center who moved here to the media department, is who got me here. And to be here where I did go to school many years ago is really exciting. I'm actually originally from North Africa, from Tunisia, and I didn't speak a word of English when I came here. America really did mean freedom to me. And to be an artist was even greater freedom, and I never thought I could be that, and that's part of the reason why I went to art history. But you know, when you have something you have to do, you do it. So it exploded out of me, no matter what. The reason I bring up the little autobiographical thing was pretty big influence in my life. The fact that I wasn't born there, but I was raised there. My mother is from Tunisia, my father from France, and originally from Portugal. And North Africa, being in the middle of the Mediterranean, was, or Tunisia is where I'm from, is this was a very poetic place, a place where you really feel the land and you really feel the natural forces. I was raised in a Catholic convent in Carthage. I'm of Jewish background, but in an Islamic country. So I had a lot of all these things around me of influence. And then my mother left. She had been to the US before. She was a playwright, and she decided to come back to the United States. She'd been in the United States in the 30s and the 40s. And it was a huge rupture for me. And I say that because a lot of my work has to do with location. With a need to find some kind of grounding. But what's interesting is that it's really evolved into I understood a few years ago why I had the background that I had, that kind of displacement, that kind of is to explore and to really try and understand our place, you know, like in the greater context. So I'm gonna go back to this slide in a minute. I will start, what I want to start with, it was kind of hard to decide what to show, so I'm showing a number of things. I'm going to start with a project that I did in 2012, with actually with someone who came from the media department, who'd graduated from the media department. Materia Prima was my studio assistant at the time, and he helped me with the project. And what it was at Mount Wilson, and it was for a show called Knowledges. It was a festival. I don't know how many of you knew about this festival. Anybody saw it? Very few people saw it. Not only that, people went out all the way to Mount Wilson, and they got turned down because they could only have so many people up at the observatory. And I had studied, I had studied Edwin Hubble. I had studied Einstein. I studied Pasadena in the 40s and how Hubble and Einstein had been together. And I found out that at Mount Wilson was this 150-foot-long footbridge between the two telescopes. There's a 60-inch telescope and a 100-inch telescope. How many of you have been there to Mount Wilson Observatory? A few, very. It's an amazing place. And on that bridge is when they discussed, Hubble was trying to talk Einstein into believing that the universe was expanding, was forever expanding, and Einstein didn't believe him in the beginning, and then he did. So I was really interested in that occurred on that bridge, and also that was such an important moment when Hubble came up with that. And I was thinking, what's happening now in the 21st century in terms of space? And at the time I was working on this, I was also working with John Good, who's an astrophysicist at Caltech. And he's working on the Kepler mission, which is the mapping of all the extrasolar planets that are now, that we know, are circling around stars in our own solar system. So the piece is about that. It's what you're seeing now is a 5-minute documentation of it. I was really, you'll see the different things that I use in terms of media. I had a group from the Los Angeles Master Chorale, and I wrote a libretto, a very short libretto, and the data that's in there comes from NASA, from all the planets that are being discovered and how fast they're rotating, that kind of thing. And I asked one of the singers if she could write the music for this libretto. I told her the kind of music I liked, and she did. And so this is what we have. So let's see, excuse me, I'll go back. Does it sound up?
Kepler object of interest 246.01. Planet mass class subterran. 8.86 times the size of the Earth. Orbiting around its star every 5.4 days. In the constellation Cygnus. 123.47 light years from planet Earth. Kepler object of interest 245.04. Planet mass class Mercury.
In the constellation Cygnus.
0.08 times the size of the Earth. Orbiting around its star every 51.2 days. In the constellation Lyra. 52.98 light years from planet Earth. Kepler object of interest 245.03. Planet mass class, Mercury, 0.06 times the size of the Earth. Orbiting around its star every 13.37 days. In the constellation,
0.78 times the size of the Earth.
52.98 light years from planet Earth. If the naked
In the
eye
constellation
could
6,
the nighttime sky would not be black. It would be pure white light.
Kepler object of interest 960.
Kepler object of interest 245.02. Planet mass class subterranean. 0.51 times the size of the Earth. Orbiting around its star every 21.3
Constellation 6,
In the constellation Lyra. 52.98 light years from planet Earth.
the naked eye can only perceive it.
Kepler object of interest 245.01. Planet mass class subterranean. 5.75 times the size of the Earth.
956.01.
Orbiting around its star every
Planet mass class
39.79 days.
12.82
In the constellation
times
Lyra. 52.98 light years from planet Earth.
in the constellation Lyra.
If the naked eye could only perceive it,
512.07
the nighttime sky would not be black. It would be
Kepler
pure
object of
white
interest
light.
955.01. Planet mass class super
Kepler object of interest
9.5 times the size of the Earth.
Planet mass class Neptune
7.04 days.
10.51
In the constellation
times the size of the Earth.
1,000.
Orbiting around its star every
06 light years.
6.24 days. In the constellation Lyra.
Object of interest 954.02.
257.17
Planet
light years
mass
from
class
planet Earth.
Neptune. 9.5.
Kepler object of interest 242.01.
Around its star every
Planet mass class Neptunian. 24.21
Constellation
times
Cygnus.
the size of the Earth.
900.
Orbiting around its star every 7.26
Kepler
days.
object of interest
Constellation Lyra. 719.44 light years from planet Earth.
9.5 times the size of the Earth.
The sky was down to Earth,
Star every 8.2 days.
into a lens,
In the constellation Cygnus.
presence among people.
Planet Earth.
Kepler object of interest 241.01.
Planet mass
Planet
class
mass class
Neptune.
subterranean.
19.
4.04 times the size of the Earth.
Orbiting around its
Orbiting
star.
around its star every 13.82 days. In the constellation Cygnus.
207.32 light years.
65 light years from planet Earth. Kepler object of interest 240.01. Planet mass class Neptune.
Kepler object of
14.05 times the size of the Earth. Orbiting around its star every 4.29 dimensions. 235.01 Cygnus. Planet mass class subterranean. 1,016.39 light years. Orbiting around its star every 5.63 days.
section.
In constellation Cygnus. 427.46 light years.
And all of this in only one small section.
Small section of the sky.
One small section of the sky.
And all this in only one small section of the sky.
One small section
One
of the
small
sky.
section of the sky.
All of this in only one small section of the sky.
Okay, so that is the project I did in 2012. And it's interesting how I go from these very large projects out different places in the earth. They're almost like research, and then I do projects like this, and it goes back and forth from that kind of thing. So the next thing is I go back to that, and the reason I picked this, I I named the show Prime Meridian 0 Degree because originally it was going to be, what I was interested in is how we're located, like how do we, if we have the North Pole and the South Pole above and below us at exactly 0 degree, where are we located? And then I started to think, well, at what intersection does the latitude and longitude meet? And apparently this has absolutely no meaning except that it falls in the Gulf, in the Atlantic Ocean. And the Atlantic Ocean, of course, is salty and has salt, and salt is something that I'm really interested in as a material in terms of what it represents, in terms of makes us up, in terms of what it says about the planet. And the next project I'm going to be doing, I haven't started yet, I've started in terms of what I'm doing with it. It's going to be the idea of Earth as clock, and I'm going to be going to the largest salt flats in the world. They're called Salar de Uyuni salt flats in Bolivia. And that shows you from Google Map how you can, that white, you can even see, from that far how large they are. They're also extremely high. They're 12,000 feet above ground. And that's how big they are. And this is the kind of space which I've always been interested in, that kind of minimal space where you can really sense your own connection between the earth and the sky. So I will be going on a trip in June as a research trip and create an installation performance out there when all the funding works. But this is the kind of space, and the reason I'm interested in it also is the fact that it completely is reflective when it rains, so that the distinction between the earth and the sky is almost not there. And that's the idea of the earth as a mirror is also something that I think we all can relate to. So everything is, you have all kinds of weather patterns and so I had a conversation earlier with Amy, who's one of those grad students here, who was my student at Art Center, and we were talking about what's happening now in terms of acceleration of time that we're all feeling, but also more and more of an interest in terms of locating ourselves. I just visited a student who is doing something with tracking, where he's tracking all his movements through, like we're all tracked essentially, right, on our iPhones, on our phones. And that whole thing of being able to really be able to relate who we are be able to understand who we are in the large space, essentially, in the cosmos. These are actual salt mounds. They use a lot of the salt for lithium, but of course it's for other kinds of things. And then at night, there's this incredible reflection of the stars onto the ice, the salt. It looks like ice, and that's also a picture from that. So I'm going to go to the next thing, which is a project I've been working with John Good at Caltech with, which is the mapping of the stars that are 90 degrees overhead on the planet, onto the planet, and hoping to actually, it's again using the Earth as clock. It would be like one moment in time, and making this both a digital and a physical project. This was over Delhi, a proposal over Delhi. The piece was going to happen, and then in the end it didn't, so what you're seeing here is as a proposal. By the way, you can interrupt me anytime too, if you have questions. So these were different sites where I calculated where the placement of the stars would be. And then this is this is in the Arctic Circle, which is in direct alignment to a project I did in Antarctica. And this is in Istanbul. And another project is in Paris. This long line here is the avenue of it used to be called the Avenue of the Sun King of Louis XIV. And what's interesting about it is that it is actually aligned to the sunrise at a certain date, not the solstice, but in between the solstice and the equinoxes. And I propose a piece around Place de la Concorde where the obelisk is, which is in alignment to the Louvre and the end of the Champs-Élysées, where the star points would be on the Earth. Slide. So this is the alignment from where the entire Avenue of the Sun King is literally aligned to the sunrise, and it goes to the Arc of Triumph. And at one point, I proposed to do a laser piece that would really emphasize that alignment. I also wanted to do a project where part of the piece would be a performance where the spheres would be coming down with parachutists, with skydivers, and so that's where they would be coming down. And the reason I'm showing that slide now is I'm going to talk about this other project that I think some of you were involved in, or I know Amy was involved in. This is for the Pacific Standard Time exhibit that the Getty put together last year or 2 years ago. And they were doing they were archiving the art that was done in Los Angeles from 1945 to 1980. And I was asked to recreate one of my works that I'd done in 1980, which was this that I called Spine of the Earth. But this had happened in the desert. And when they asked me, I said, well, I would redo it if I can, in fact, use skydivers to come down and make the piece with a pigment. And then they said, well, we couldn't have people come out to the desert. They couldn't organize that. So it was going to be in the city. So I chose this site. I don't know how many of you know this piece, this park. It's called the Baldwin Hills Scenic Overlook. And it's this incredible park that is fairly new. I had never seen it before. And when I saw this amazing stairway, it looked like a temple to me. And I said, I have to do something with that line. And so what I decided to do was to recreate the piece I'd done in a completely different way, where instead of pigment, I would use people, and I would have a skydiver come down, all dressed in red, and then people would spiral around her and then come down the stairs to form the spine of the Earth. Interestingly enough, it had been called Spine of the Earth, and here was really what did happen here. So I'll show you. This is the stairway. You have an incredible view of Los Angeles there. This is the skydiver in the distance who's coming around. And then this is from the video that was on top of her head. She happens to be a world record accuracy diver, and said she could land on a dime. Yes. Does it seem slow to you? I think she was at 3,000 feet, which is pretty low. We usually don't touch that. So when you're on the ground there, you have a completely different experience than what we're seeing now, of course. I keep that in. So these are just some shots of her from the ground. And for some reason, I thought she would be going down vertically. That was kind of my vision, but it doesn't happen that way. So, so it's, you know, when you have these kinds of ideas that are so in your head, right, they're imaginary, and to try and make them actually happen, something else occurs. So I'm kind of interested in that. I'm interested in that space in between. And what this does, this kind of project is so, we got together about 500 people all together, and it's all contingent on the weather. And it had rained the entire week, and we just got lucky that we were able to do it. So there's a lot of risks and excitement with this kind of work. So this is us beginning to, and all the other people are starting to come downstairs. Do you recognize yourself, Amy? Well, I'm just so interested in how our perception of how we are on this level, and then from up high, how totally different it is, and these patterns. Oops. Happened. And so we had a helicopter that was really circling them the whole time. No, that was an airplane that dropped her, and the helicopter carried the Michael Light, actually, who's an amazing photographer who shot these. So we had both. We had an airplane and a helicopter, and then this is kind of close up, and then this is kind of in the context of the city. And some people actually told me that they were on the freeway, on the 10 freeway, and saw it, which was pretty interesting. So that was that project. Whoops, and that's from the, yeah, that's from, whoops, from the ground. Yeah, I really wanted to, it took a long time to figure out what to do with them. They definitely had to be red. And it took me, I thought I designed some, the budget, of course, was always a big thing. And in the end, we found these suits in London. I mean, through the internet, but we found them. What was their purpose? Painters suits, but you don't find red ones here, and with the head too. And they're made out of Tyvek, which is this really, and I signed every single one of them, and yeah. So why the red? Because I was supposed to recreate the piece I'd done in 1980, and why red in 1980? The colors that I use are really elemental, really primal for very elemental kind of reasons. And the red at that time was for, and I use a lot of red in my work, it was primal energy coming from the interior of the earth. And the idea, I called it Spine of the Earth because I found out later, after I did this piece, that Australian Aborigines actually do spirals where they put their spine to the middle of the center of spiral to have that kind of connection between heaven and earth. And I thought it was so interesting that 30 years later, what had been a flat piece and had been titled that because of a person sitting there became literally like a spine in there. So that was kind of interesting. I'm thinking now of going to really way back and then coming forward. I'd like to show this slide of Chichen Itza in the Yucatan, in that when I went there, I was fascinated with how when you stand on top of this pyramid, you're in the middle of this rectangle and you can see the entire horizon of the earth down below you. So the perspective of the horizon is different. And it felt like perhaps these spaces were built so that the priesthood would come up there and be that connection between the sky and the earth. So I thought that was, and this is looking all around in the middle of the jungle. Whoops. And they have an observatory and then the pyramid there. And I guess what impressed me more than anything is this incredible flatness down below. This is a view outside my home in Tunisia, and the kind of horizon line that I would always see. This was a view outside down from the Catholic convent I was brought up in, and there were Roman ruins, and they remind me of like sentinels, like, looking out. And I bring it up in terms of when as Victoria said, I started out as a painter. And then in the mid-70s, I really became interested in space. I was very influenced by Robert Irwin and his work, and how with a mark on a wall, like he did a black line in a gallery space and completely made two volumes out of this line. I thought, wow, what if I did, just a mark in the landscape, and what would that do? And the first thing that I did was this, in a place that I lived in, this artist colony that was 132 acres of land overlooking the ocean. And so it had the same kind, and it faced south, so it had the same kind of orientation. And I did this piece, which was essentially a trench that I filled with blue pigment. But perceptually, the blue of the pigment went straight out to the horizon. In fact, now I don't know if you can, but I can see an after image in yellow on the ocean. And it went out all the way to the horizon to form a cross. It kind of reminded me of that. This is another view of it. This is 10 months later. So I was really interested in putting down a very artificial color, and with the light of the sun that changes everything all around it all the time, what happens to that? This was the moon set right there, so I call this moon shadow. It had two different color blue pigments. This is like 1978. And I had gone to Death Valley, where there were these huge white mountain, low mountains that I wanted to cover in blue to essentially unite the blue with the sky. I wanted them to melt together. And of course, I didn't have permission. My friends refrained me, so I did this solitary rock. But learned later that at the very same time, a French artist covered 1 kilometer square of the Saudi Arabian desert, the Sinai Desert. But he didn't do it in powder. He did it in actual paint, and it's still there. And interesting ideas come at the same time. This was about a year later. This is in Death Valley. I did a lot of works with the human figure. I thought it was really interesting how what looks like these cave paintings, they obviously got it from shadows. My friends were playing around on a on a hill, and had that shape that looked just like the cave paintings. And then the next project was, again at that time, where I was the first time that I brought rocks out to this flat, it wasn't a salt bed, but a dry lake bed, and I placed them in the alignment of the stars above. This is also 1978. So these are very early works. But bringing them, I'm showing them to you in terms of that painting quality, that I really was painting, essentially, but also talking about all these locations and alignments. This piece had been 10 figures going toward the mountain, the horizon of the mountain, and then the wind came and actually made the piece. So again, I'm interested in these things that come in and shift the piece to something a lot more interesting. What happened? I don't know what happened. Yeah, the blue's great. That's okay, thank you. And then this is what it was like before and after. Then the very first piece I did indoors, this is a detail of a piece that I called Materia Prima. And it was done at the very same time that a total solar eclipse was happening. And what's interesting, it's very hard to see from the slides, but the yellow was so intense that it completely made people, it repelled them, and the blue, which is a very dark blue, they wanted to jump in it. And the yellow literally hovered over the blue, perceptually. So I was kind of playing with these really intense colors. This was in 1979. This was the first time I worked in relationship to architecture. A friend of mine was a landscape designer and was about to cover this piece with, the driveway with concrete, and she said, why don't you do something here? And I did it off of the geometry of the architecture. I called it Window into the Earth. And this is a project I did in 1980. It was part of the International Sculptural Conference in DC. And originally I was going to cover the shadow of the monument in blue, so that at one point in time, the real shadow would align with the blue pigment shadow. But it turned out that it was at least 2,000 feet long at one, and so I decided better change. And I thought, well, why don't I do just the tip of the monument, that shadow of the tip? I worked with an astronomer. This was the first time I worked with an astronomer, and he calculated where the shadow was going to fall. And then what would happen, I would stake it out the nights before, and people would take out the stake. So at the end, I guessed, and and there we are down there, we're working, but it worked. And then this is like right in the middle. And so it was really, it came out of something, it came out of two images that had come to me of seeing a red pyramid in the interior of the Earth. And also, I had just gone to the Walter de Maria lightning field, and I was thinking about these long pieces, doing great big shadows. And so I used it to, like metaphysical fantasy of locating this red pyramid. That's how I started doing the piece, but it really became a giant clock. Again. And this was just a few minutes later. So you see how fast, so it was really this thing of how fast we're rotating around the sun, right? We're talking about maybe 12 minutes. And at one point, apparently, Walter Hobson had talked about doing this as a permanent piece with stone, which I thought would have been great. So that's it from the Washington Monument. That gives you an idea. So it was really the idea of that through the rotation of the Earth rotating around the sun, casting shadows at the directional lines, it revealed a certain geometry that was a sense of tremendous energy. And then the next project I did out in the desert was this one that I showed earlier. I'll go quickly. So from the ground, you can hardly see it. And then from the air, you get to see what the geometry of it is. In 1981, I did a project at the Hirshhorn Museum, and I called it "The Horizon is the Place That Maintains the Memory." And it's kind of the idea of the horizon of the moon maintaining the memory of the Earth. Because there's that great, at that time we didn't have that NASA picture, but the great picture that you can see the crescent Earth over the horizon of the moon. And this wasn't a performance, but it was putting up the piece with red pigment. And they had to, it was a room, a cube that was 12-foot cube, and they ended up putting a glass over it because they didn't want the pigment to get everywhere, but apparently it did. Another project, 1982, with dancers, where I asked them to dance a spiral, and then essentially it was like we did like a drawing, and we filled it with paint or pigment, and so it was. So this is what it looked like from the ground. But in the air, it was like that, and then I went back around and shot this. And again, this is when things come in and shift the piece. 2 motorcycles had come and waited all day. And I find that just as interesting, if not more than that. So I thought that was really interesting to see what happens when you do things out in nature. And I'm skipping around a lot. In 1996, I did a project at the pyramids. It was part of the Cairo Biennale. And I had always been interested in, I'd done a piece called "Pyramids Are Chunks of Stars Fallen from the Sky." And I'd always wanted to place the pyramids in a field of stars. And when I was asked to do something ephemeral there, at that time I found out that this Egyptian engineer had figured out that the pyramids had been aligned to Orion's belt. A lot of you may know about this. And so I was really interested in that. And, but then I decided that, this gets complicated. I was working with also the image of bee, because the bee is the symbol of Egypt in pharaonic days. And so what I wanted to do was to do a honeybee pattern in front of the pyramids. And so what this is different honeycomb patterns. And so I had chosen to do this one. And then I hired a surveyor to make sure I did it mathematically correct. And he decided that what I was really doing were Stars of David, which I wasn't. And they stopped the project. And they almost threw me in jail. It went around, the news went around the world because I was this Jewish spy. So after a week of trying to get, negotiations, I said, well, I had this other idea of placing them in a field of stars, and we had one day to do the project. So I couldn't be correct, astronomically, but in one day we were able to put 3 tons of powder blue pigment on the ground, and did this essentially this kind of star map. Yeah, you never know what to get. Um, I'll quickly go through this. This was a show I had at the Pepperdine at the Fred Weisman Museum. And I built, the wall is 25 feet by 55 feet. It's a huge wall on which I essentially drew a star map. And I kind of created a whole like environment as if you were, it was very disorienting. You can't see the lines here, but on the, they were all two-dimensional, and on the floor I had the same thing but three-dimensionally. And you walked in there and you felt you were inside a spaceship. You couldn't quite tell where you were. But I also had two videos. One was of what I call the Star Keeper, and the other one was the Beekeeper. And the bee that I mentioned earlier had come from an image that I'd seen that just came in my mind when I was in Egypt of the Earth from space. And instead of continents, it was in the shape of a honeybee. And I was really fascinated with that. And I researched it. It turned out it was the symbol of Lower Egypt. So I worked a lot with bees and honey. And then I thought, well, astronauts and beekeepers look alike, right? They have the same kind of, what is their relationship? So I started calling the astronaut a star keeper. And then I did a video actually with Chandler McWilliams from here and John Beasley of this. And I went to them and I said, I want to conflate the star keeper and I want to do something about the star keeper and the beekeeper and how alike they are. And we decided to conflate them. And it'll take me a minute to get to the video. Hang on. What do I do with it? Oh, hang on. Whoops. Okay. So we ended up doing a 2-minute video, and Chandler essentially created the program. So instead of using both, we ended up using just the beekeeper, and he then it could be stars or bees or particles. So I don't know how we're doing on time. Yeah? Should I keep going? Okay. What? Okay, good. Okay, so that's an image from that. And we also created some photographic work that came from the program that Chandler used, which was all these lines that followed their own course. So they went from maybe 28,000 to over 1 million lines. That this was one of the prints. So it's just following the particle. Then I'm going into this other project that I did in 2006. And when I was doing the pyramid project, I get a lot of just flashes. And one of them, and what I saw was the Earth from space that had nothing on it but gold-tipped pyramids, all aligned to the stars. And I thought, wow, what a great image. I'm sure at one point, you know, there's been remnants everywhere on the planet that there was that kind of mapping. And I was, of course, very impelled to do something like that, not pyramids, but star points. So that's, you've seen some of the things I started. But I decided the idea came to me of to start at the North and at the South Pole. So to do a mirror reflection of the stars at the North Pole and at the South Pole. Again, I wanted it to be simultaneous. It's impossible because weather, you can't be in total darkness. But I thought if you went from star point to star point conceptually, it would be as if a shaft of light is coming through the center of the Earth. And then I thought, well, that's just one moment in time. That's just a snapshot of if you make the stars stop. But if you take two stars at both poles with the rotation of the Earth, and you take that movement through the center of the Earth, you get what resembles the DNA connected to the stars. And the idea of light as information, and then light as information, stars as information, motion, all connected to who we are. And I thought I was really fascinated. And I did a video of that a little later on. But what I'm showing now is, of course, we're somewhere in there. And this photo that emphasizes Antarctica. And so this shows the motion of the counterclockwise and the clockwise motion. It would be fantastic to be able to do something on that scale, but impossible. So that's just, these are just sketches of the idea. So what this represents is the motion of the stars at the poles, because here they go from east to west, but at the poles they move in concentric spiraling circles. These were just essentially to get my ideas down in terms of going through that prime meridian 0 degree. And then we ended up, I had wanted to make this project exactly at the South Pole, and right at the last minute they decided that there were 5 of us, that there were too many of us and they couldn't accommodate that. And I almost didn't do the project, but the astronomer that was on my team said, you know, it's either you don't do it or you do it at McMurdo Station, which is about 600 kilometers away from the South Pole. And I'm really glad I ended up doing that, even though it didn't do the exact alignment I wanted. And so we had a site, the W221 site is our site. I received a grant from the National Science Foundation. That's how we were able to get there. I didn't say that, that's an important part. The only way to go there is usually as a tourist, and you pay, you know, $30,000 and you're just on a boat the whole time. This was, there's an artists and writers program, and of course science. And you can stay as long as it takes to do the work that you need to do. They don't give you money, but they completely outfit you and take care of you while you're there. Antarctica is the windiest continent in the world, and so we had to test the spheres that I was going to use for the star points. We actually went to a wind tunnel, not the one we have here because in Pasadena, but down in San Diego. And we tested it. I worked with Simon Baum from Santa Monica City College, the astronomer there, and did a lot of calculations. And then there we are on the field. And we essentially placed these, we worked with a GPS and placed this in alignment to the stars above. Do they look oval? Fiberglass.
And in order for them not to fly away, then are they weighted or?
Yes, what's interesting, they're done in halves. They have a screw inside, and then we have a meter-long thing that gets, yeah. But then we had to also do 4 holes with ropes at minus 40-degree weather. It was really, so they were completely weighted down in 5 points. This shows it to you from there, and here you can really see the constellation.
Is the size based on distance or brightness?
Luminosity. Yeah, brightness. I do, but I didn't bring them here. I do. I have a lot of that. Can you help me with this? Okay. Yeah, the job was really pretty amazing. We applied for the National Science Foundation in 2004 in June, and then we got the grant immediately, and then they said no, but then somebody, they changed the person who was.
Sorry, okay, sorry.
And so we didn't, it was a long process. It was a 3-year process. And so I had a team here, and we worked, we have all the documentation of that. I actually have, I don't think I have it here, though. I have a video of the whole putting together the project, which was, yeah, pretty amazing. Because originally, they were going to be whole, and there were 600 cubic feet for an airplane, to get there. And they said, no way, so there was a lot of logistics that, it took 3 years with a team of about 5 here.
Is that the first grant NSF made to an artist for this kind of?
The first? No, they've been giving the grants since 20 years, for the last 20 years, but mainly writers and this kind of painter, And so I was the first installation artist, and of course the largest project they'd ever done. The only reason, the main reason they accepted me was because it was also science. William Fox is the director of the Center for Art and the Environment in Reno, Nevada. I'm going to have a show there in the fall. And he was on the committee, and he told me. And he said, the fact that it was science, they totally loved it. But I think that had to do with it. But yeah, it was the largest. It's pretty unusual. And the other thing is, for instance, I got very lucky. I was there at the same time that they give a grant to Werner Herzog, the director Werner Herzog, who happens to be my idol. And yeah, and we got to be buddies. We did. It was great. Yeah, really, really. He wanted to shoot while I was doing it. Unfortunately, I know, I would have been in that film. I would have been kind of weird, I think. But why did I bring it up? Oh, yes. I brought it up because he did that entire film with one other person. He just had a cinematographer. And we were 5. And so for them, it was, because I found out that it cost them $10,000 a day per person to take care of you there. So, yeah. So that's why it's such an extraordinary thing. So, the good old days. I know. 5 weeks. You don't want to make the computation. It's embarrassing. Right. So it's pretty extraordinary. But hopefully, thanks to William Fox, there's going to be a big book of this project, which I think the idea will live on. And that's part of what the National Science Foundation does. The reason they give the grants to artists and writers. When it started, the polls weren't when the grant started, the polls were not in the news. They wanted to talk about the polls and make them known, and a lot of people have done that, photographers and that kind of thing. So they require that you do publication, that you do exhibits. They don't fund you to do that, but they do want that to happen. When you get the grant, before you get the grant, they want to know if you have shows that are set up and that kind of thing. So one of the things that we had were helicopters. Not a whole lot of hours, but we had some hours with helicopters that we could go and do. We had to learn how to drive big vehicles. And
Was one of your crew members a photographer then?
Yes, yes. My crew was mainly media oriented. There was the astronomer, and then I had a photographer, Jean de Pomereau from France, and then Sophie Pegram was a videographer, and Lionel Cousin was a French filmmaker. Yeah. So this happens to be a lot of the scientists actually from, and I managed to have them come and move in the motion of the stars at the poles. So they did this kind of spiraling walk, which ended up okay. Then 6 months later, no, I came back, I came back in January of 2007, and I had applied I wanted to go to the North Pole. Now there's nothing up there, there's certainly nothing giving you grants up there, but I found out that Cork Expeditions gives artists in residencies aboard a Russian nuclear icebreaker. So I applied and I got it immediately. I mean, immediately meaning as soon as I got back from Antarctica. So I didn't have time to really put together, to actually do the piece at the North Pole, but I did a research trip there and I used the passengers to do that same motion. And part of my job there was to teach them how to draw like polar bears. And, but I ended up doing this. So this is facing the North Pole. This is the day that they call this a fog bow. It's kind of hard to see. And there was a helicopter on board here too, so we could go out on it and get these amazing views of this ship on the way to 90 degrees north. And so the only way you know that you're there is with a GPS. Of course, everybody celebrates when we get there. And then there's a nice specialist, and if the ice is okay, they let us off for a couple hours. And this is my crew of the passengers down there. And they had yellow anyway. Yeah, no, I didn't have. The ready-made there, and the ready-made over the other south was red, yes. And this is where the North Pole actually was, the exact position. And what was happening at the same time, a friend of mine told me, was that Russia was down below in submarines placing a flag right underneath the North Pole. And this female was putting a blue orb right at the same time. So one was claiming two very different kinds of claims. And then from this, I did a show at Art Center, and it was a collaboration with Caltech, actually. And there's a video that shows the piece there, and then we had a 4-channel projection of that idea I told you about of the DNA, and it kind of went there. And then I guess I'll end with the cover of the book that's going to be coming out on the project. So. Questions? Oh, yes.
Let me repeat that.
Yes, I'll do it again.
Could you say a few words about the show you're installing on the other side of campus at the Art Science Center in California Nanosystems Institute?
Yes. So, as I said before, the inspiration came from the idea of location and also this location, like wanting to have us really connect with our placement, but also being thrown off. And so what I've done is an animation, and we'll be having a performance. I can't say too much because it's very simple, and there will be a performance at 5:30 that it may be an ongoing performance, but it's about all this subject, as you can see. Yeah. That's tomorrow night
That's
at 5
tomorrow
o'clock.
at 6 o'clock on the
6.
other side of campus. We've been working on this for a while, and it's quite exciting. So, in the true art science tradition, she's here giving a talk, and she's doing the art in the science building.
Right.
So, any questions here? Can I pass this on? Everybody's stunned.
He has a question.
And it is with regards to your exhibition that's going to be at the Nevada
Yes.
Museum of Art, and then this book. What is it just the project of Antarctica or other works?
It's mainly the project in Antarctica, but it's other pieces are going to contextualize it. So, and it's also a lot of my writing that I did while I was there. So, yeah, so it's a combination of both.
So it will be photographs, video, writings, sculpture, all kinds of all media.
Mainly the ephemeral pieces, yeah. Because I haven't shown, I've done a tremendous amount of public work, which is more architectural and videos and that kind of thing, but and paintings and sculptures. But yeah, no, they're pretty much focused on wanting to make this the main thing, and everything else supports it. So whatever supported it, it's going to be pretty nice.
Beautiful,
I'm
can't wait.
excited. You had a question.
My question was, a lot of your work is, very site-specific and in remote areas on huge scales. So I just was curious how you consider your audience, your immediate audience, and then obviously the world in general afterwards, because it seems like they're really difficult works to produce, and your audience might be quite small in the physical space. So I'm just curious to hear about that aspect of your work.
You mean in which manner? Like in
Meaning-
terms of how I think about the
Yeah, how you
audience?
think
or-
about the pieces, kind of the action, and then maybe
Right.
the documentation, and how you
Right.
translate
That's
that.
always, this very difficult thing, especially when you work out in remote areas. And the reason I work in the remote areas is because it's important to have that kind of stillness and that kind of space that you can't have anywhere else. When we were there and with this particular project, we were just so sad that nobody could see it. It was like, oh my God, like it was just, so we just have to, the documentation becomes that, right? And I'm very interested, of course, in having an audience and having them see it. But it's always been, and I do a lot of things where there is an audience, but I'm not sure I'm quite answering. It's quite a complex problem or issue with art in general. Yes.
But one of the things that to me is fascinating, the way that, and that's why I asked you about your crew going to Antarctica, because very much on the question that Gareth just asked, you were so prepared to be able to, you knew that it would be so ephemeral, that
Yes.
no one would see it.
Yes.
But at the same time, it needed to exist in all possible ways. And I think that's amazing that you foresaw that with such precision. And that's why we have this, and that's why the exhibition that will be at Nevada. So yeah, that's
Yeah,
amazing
I
having
know.
that
Some
going
people
from
think
you.
it's like, how can you do, and I remember when I first started doing the ephemeral works, they say, why do you do that? And then nobody sees them, and then they disappear. And it's, just something I have to do. And, and they live, they're a mark, they live as a trace, essentially. And everything is, so. But it's the need to put it out, no matter what it takes, and no matter, as long as we have the documentation. If I couldn't do, in fact, the very first time I did pieces in the desert, I was with a young Cal Arts artist who was helping me, who was a John Baldessari student, and she said, and very Marxist, and she said, why are you documenting this? Like, you shouldn't be documenting this. She was like, and she was, it was so 70s, So, yeah, it would be Cal Arts.
And I want to say one more thing, but I'm also hoarding this. Anybody needs something else? But I just wanted to go back to the idea of the sense of home or the sense of belonging, because myself as an immigrant, I also feel that I left something, and I'm constantly, with everything that I'm doing, there is a lightness of the idea that there is not such thing as a home, but at the same time, I'm always looking for it. With
Yes.
every piece that I'm doing, that I'm trying to, again, think of location.
This is such a major issue for all of us, because I think that whole, I mean, kind of get spiritual in this case, but you know, we all have this deep thing of where do we come from, right? I mean, it's part of the human person, and some of us have been displaced, some not, but even those who have not been displaced, there is that sense of where do we come from? You know, who are we? You know, and I think that's part of. I think some of us have been displaced as artists. You know, we either we become artists because of that or whatever. But to visualize that need for not the need, but the question, and it's such a major issue. And I've been wanting to write this book that I would call Home, or Pyramids of Chunks of Stars Fallen from the Sky, right? That would be the title. Because I think, you know, we come from there. I mean, we are them, but it's a very poetic, very important, very deeply soulful issue.
Well, thank you for denting the earth with your colors and paintings, and for presenting this. And please do come tomorrow. It's going to be a very special presentation. You're actually going to see it. You don't have to go to Antarctica. You have to go to the other side of campus.
Yes, and that may be as far as Antarctica.
So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.